in Vermont, the duties of the Poet Laureate, and I don't know, it may be the same in New York State, but they're non-specific. It's really an honorary post, and you can do something with it if you choose to, or you can just take the honor and go about your business. My immediate predecessor, the wonderful poet Ruth Stone, who unfortunately died a couple of weeks after I was appointed, was 92 when she was appointed and blind, so she was not in a position to get out much. But I wanted to, and I chose libraries, I think, because one assumes that people who come to libraries have an interest at least in language, though not necessarily, and usually not in poetry. But they're curious, they're interested in language, and are usually quite bright and inquiring. If they manage to show up at all, that is some sign of their inquisitiveness. And yet, I wanted, after 40 plus years in the academic context, to talk to people who were literate but not literary, to make that distinction. Also, not to, not to poke the eye of the entity that sustained me for a long, long time. When they asked questions, they were usually questions designed to elicit information rather than demonstrate how much they already knew themselves, and that has proved to be the case. But what was I going to do when I got there? I kind of came up with the itinerary before I came up with the agenda. And of course, the question that I raised, as most of us who practice poetry do, is why do people, even those who are interested in reading and in literature, nonfiction or fiction, what have you, why do they tend to either abandon poetry after it's a requisite in a college or high school course, or after they've sort of fizzled out on it? What keeps them from re-engaging? And there are lots and lots of reasons. There's no simple answer to that. Poetry has always been a minority art, with the exceptions of people like Frost and the schoolroom poets. It was always a fairly select audience. One of the things that I have discovered simply empirically in talking to people and really asking them that question, one of the factors is that they have been perhaps miseducated by English teachers, and I don't exempt myself, into believing that poetry is some kind of encoded mode of discourse. So you had to learn a special language. It was like a cabal, and you had to study for years before you could be admitted into its inner sancta. And in some cases, for better or worse, that may be true, but in the poets that I like to read, I try to point out to them that this is a man or woman saying something to you, talking about recognizable experiences. Don't let your sense of having to interpret or get what the poet is trying to say, that is always the operative phrase, as if he or she had some terrible throat disease. Don't let that get in the way of simply going with the poem primarily as a unit of language. See if you enjoy the language, see if you can go with the language. You'll be surprised where that may take you in terms of what we call rather reductively, I think, meaning in a poem. Don't, in other words, imagine that poetry is, as my late friend Bill Matthews once quipped, poetry criticism in reverse. In other words, the poet had some philosophical or psychological insight, which he or she then covered up with all these, this fancy language, which you then came along and were obliged to peel away so that you could get back to the meaning. And I use a variety of of poets, both quote established, quote, and otherwise. Ones that I encountered, have encountered in my travels, are people who haven't really made much of a name for themselves necessarily at all, as illustrations. And I say, well, the first thing you want to ask as you read this poem is, does the language please you? That's primary. If it doesn't, that's a real strike against the poet. And then who's talking here? Where is he or she? To whom, if that's relevant? And why? Can you get some sense of that and reading the text without horsewhipping yourself into saying something that you think sounds intelligent. You know, everybody, and this is true, I'm sure you've experienced it yourself, Don, and beginning writers, that if you're in a workshop or something, they're always afraid that they'll say, I'm not sure this is what you want, or this may be stupid, but, you know, and I always told my students, especially in writing courses, but also in academic courses, as I tell the library constituencies, you know, there aren't any dumb questions. When you confront the poem, you have to ask these basic questions. Don't jump over them. You know, like, if you don't understand it, there may be some reason you don't understand it. It may not be your fault. It may be the writer's fault. Or if you're uncertain as to where this poem is taking place, you know, ask that question. Let's explore that a little bit. Let's not involve ourselves proleptically in a more elevated kind of criticism. Not that I am, for a moment, assailing that kind of criticism, but that's not the primary response that we ought to have with poetry. And I think a lot of people feel that it is, and they're afraid of appearing dumb, so they go in some other direction, something that they can more easily grasp. Often things that I couldn't begin to grasp, like, oh, quantum physics or technology or whatever.